Julia woke up early that sunny Saturday. It was a special day, her 19th wedding anniversary with Nolan. As she looked at the ring on her hand, she felt the weight of years filled with love, challenges, and accomplishments. She remembered the day they said, "I do," vowing eternal love. Though time had left its marks, Julia still felt the love between them was strong. The house was quiet, except for the soft footsteps of Margot and Eliza, the couple's teenage daughters, coming down the stairs. Margot, the eldest, seemed excited about the evening's planned event. "Mom, the decorations are going to be amazing. Dad's going to love it," she said, setting the dishes on the table. Eliza, more reserved, gave a shy smile but was also looking forward to it. Nolan entered the kitchen with his usual commanding presence. Tall and warm smiled, he held a single red rose, which he handed to Julia. "Happy anniversary, my love. Thank you for all these years by my side." Julia blushed like a love-struck teenager, returning the gesture with an affectionate hug. That evening, friends and family gathered in the backyard. String lights, soft music, and a joyful atmosphere made the setting magical. Julia watched Nolan mingling with the guests, noticing how admired he was. They seemed like the perfect couple, and the night felt like a fairy tale. Everything changed when Roxanne, Julia's older sister, took the microphone to give a toast. Roxanne was known for her provocative humor, and everyone laughed at her opening words. "Julia, you've always been the perfect one in the family. I don't even know how you managed to get a man like Nolan. It almost seems like fate, doesn't it?" Her words were said in jest, but Julia noticed something strange in Roxanne's gaze. While the others laughed, Nolan briefly furrowed his brow before resuming his smile. The comment lingered in the air, but Julia brushed it aside, determined not to let anything spoil the night. Before bed, Julia lay next to Nolan and saw him lost in thought. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He denied it, but his distant look remained. That was the first night Julia felt that something, still unknown, could threaten the solid foundation they had built over nearly 2 decades. 3 days after the wedding anniversary, life at Julia's house seemed to have returned to normal. She was tending to the garden while the girls were at school, and Nolan was working in his office. The day was calm until Julia noticed an unusual letter in her mailbox. There was no sender, just her name written in uppercase letters. Curious, Julia opened the envelope right there. The message, written in simple handwriting, was brief and cryptic. "You think you know your family, but you don't even know half. Be careful who you trust." Julia's heart raced. At first, she thought it might be a cruel joke. Who would send something like this? And more importantly, why? Trying not to overthink it, she folded the letter and put it in her pocket, determined not to let it ruin her day. However, during dinner, Julia could hardly focus. Margot was enthusiastically talking about a school project, and Eliza mentioned a movie she wanted to see over the weekend, but Julia seemed distant. Nolan noticed her unease and asked, "Is everything okay, love? You seem off today." "Yes, I'm just tired. It's been a long day," Julia replied, trying to sound convincing. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, Julia took out the letter again. The message seemed to echo in her mind. Who could be trying to unsettle her? Was it someone from her family's past or Nolan's? And what did they mean by "you don't even know half"? Julia lay down next to Nolan, who was sleeping soundly, and felt a wave of unease wash over her. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The next morning, Julia still felt the weight of the anonymous letter. Determined to uncover something, she went to the small office downstairs and started rummaging through old papers. She wanted to see if she could find anything connected to the message. While sorting through old family documents, Julia came across a folder containing phone bills from years ago. Something caught her eye. Several calls to an unknown number appeared frequently over a 3-month period. They had been made during the times Nolan usually claimed to be in work meetings. Julia hesitated. It could just be a coincidence, but the unease inside her grew. On impulse, she decided to call the number. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Hello? Who's this?" the woman asked, her tone wary. Julia didn't know what to say. Her heart racing, she hung up without responding. During breakfast, Julia tried to act normal, but Nolan noticed her distraction once again. "Are you sure you're okay, Julia? You've been so quiet these past few days," he asked, looking concerned. "I'm fine. I've just been organizing some things. Nothing important," Julia quickly replied, avoiding his gaze. Later, as she put the phone bills back in the folder, Julia found something even more unsettling. A letter that appeared to have been written by her father before he died. The message was cryptic, mentioning secrets that must never be revealed and urging Julia to never trust blindly. Now, Julia was torn between two worries: Nolan's behavior and her father's mysterious words. The sense that something much larger was hidden within her family was undeniable, and she knew she needed to be cautious. That evening, Julia tried to start a casual conversation with Nolan. "Do you remember those years, a while back, when you were working so much? It felt like you were never home." Nolan paused for a moment but responded calmly. "Yes, that was a tough period. I was under a lot of pressure at work." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, nothing. It just crossed my mind." Julia smiled, but the doubt in her heart only deepened. In the quiet of the night, as Nolan slept soundly, Julia stared out the window. She knew she couldn't ignore the signs. Something was about to change in her life, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every clue, every mysterious message seemed to point to the fact that her life was about to be turned upside down. She tried to rationalize things, but deep down, she knew there was something Nolan wasn't telling her. Determined to find answers, Julia decided to confront her sister Roxanne. Although they had always had a close relationship, Roxanne had a way of keeping secrets, something Julia had known since childhood. She also knew that Roxanne could be the key to understanding what was going on. The next morning, Julia invited her to coffee. The meeting took place at a small local cafe, away from the bustle of the city. They sat at a secluded table, and Roxanne quickly noticed the seriousness in Julia's eyes. "What's going on, Julia? You've been so different, so distant," Roxanne asked, not hiding her concern. Julia looked at her sister, trying to control the anxiety that was overtaking her. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and filled with emotion. "Do you know something I don't know, Roxanne? Something about our family's past? Anything about Nolan? Because I found something." Julia paused, feeling the weight of her words. Roxanne sat in silence for a moment, and Julia noticed a subtle shift in her behavior. Her sister's expression went from confusion to something deeper, as if she was holding on to a truth she never wanted to share. "What did you find?" Roxanne asked, her tone almost cold. "A letter, and a series of calls to an unknown number, and also something about secrets, Roxanne. Why didn't anyone tell me about this before?" Roxanne hesitated again before finally opening up. With a sigh, she said, "There's something you don't know, Julia. Something very old that involves our family and Nolan." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. She was about to hear something that would change everything. Roxanne, looking around, lowered her voice and said, "The truth is, Nolan isn't who you think he is. Before he married you, he was involved in something that no one knew about. Something connected to your father." Julia's heart seemed to stop for a moment. What she was hearing was unbelievable. Nolan, the man she had been with for almost 20 years, was involved in something she didn't even know about. She felt a mix of anger and sadness, but also an overwhelming urge to understand what was happening. "What did he do, Roxanne? What's going on?" Julia asked, her voice breaking. Roxanne hesitated again but was firm in her words. "He was part of a secret your father was trying to hide. I don't know all the details, but I know it involves money, power, and lives lost." Julia's world seemed to collapse. How had she never known this? Why hadn't her father told her anything? And what else was Nolan hiding? Roxanne finished. "I didn't want you to know, but you need to understand. You need to know the truth." Julia's mind was in turmoil. She spent her days in a constant state of unease, between work, the kids, and the discoveries that were changing her view on everything. But the feeling that something was about to explode in her life never left her. That night, after a particularly difficult day, Julia decided it was time to confront Nolan. The doubt and anguish had piled up inside her, and she could no longer live with this weight. She knew that by questioning him, she would be risking everything, but she couldn't ignore the evidence that had come to light. When Nolan arrived home, he seemed relaxed, as usual. But Julia was different. She watched him as he placed his briefcase on the table and removed his jacket with a smile on his face. It was as if nothing was happening. But Julia knew that this calmness was just a facade. She stood up and walked over to him, looking at him firmly. "Nolan, we need to talk." Her voice was tense but controlled. He looked at her, surprised by the seriousness in her tone. "Sure, what happened? You seem different," Nolan said, his concern showing. Julia wasted no time. "I know about the calls. And the letter from my father. I know you were involved in something you never told me about." She looked him straight in the eye, waiting for a reaction. Nolan froze for a moment, speechless. His face turned pale, and Julia felt that she had hit the critical point. The silence stretched on for a few seconds until Nolan finally spoke, but in a low and grave tone. "I knew this moment would come. I just didn't know when," he said, clearly uncomfortable. Julia didn't know what to expect, but what Nolan said next took her completely by surprise. "I didn't want you to know, but now that you do. I was responsible for many of the things your father tried to keep from you. I got involved in illegal businesses, Julia, and your father was part of it. We were trying to hide what really happened." Julia was in shock. Nolan's words were so distorted that she could hardly believe what she was hearing. How could this be? Illegal businesses? Her father? She had spent so many years without questioning her husband, without imagining that he could be involved in something so dark. "What are you saying, Nolan? What did you do?" Julia asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I was involved in money laundering, Julia. Your father and I, well, we did things we should have never done. And now it's all coming to light. I tried to hide it, but I can't anymore. I love you, and I know you have the right to know the truth." Julia felt an emptiness fill her chest. She couldn't process everything she was hearing. The image she had of her husband, the man she had trusted for nearly 20 years, was being completely shattered. And the calls? What were you trying to hide with them? Julia forced the words out. "They were for people who were involved in what I did. I tried to keep everything secret, so you wouldn't know. So nothing would interfere with our life." Nolan replied, his voice low and heavy. Julia didn't know what to do. The man she loved was confessing something she never imagined. The sense of betrayal was indescribable, but there was something else. A deep feeling that she needed to do something with this information, even though she didn't know what. "I don't know what to do with this, Nolan. I need time to think," Julia said, stepping away from him. She looked at him one last time, feeling that the trust she once had was completely destroyed. The future of her marriage was at stake, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. After Nolan's devastating confession, Julia found herself in a state of total shock. She could hardly process the words he had just said, and the weight of the revelation still suffocated her. The house, which had once been a safe haven for her and her daughters, now felt like a dark place where everything she had built was crumbling before her eyes. She locked herself in her bedroom and spent hours in silence, unsure of what to do. Nolan's face was still etched in her mind, but she couldn't feel anything but a mix of sadness and anger. How could he have hidden something so serious? How could he have lied for so long, lived a life of lies? And most painfully, how could he have involved her in all of this? Julia knew she couldn't make a hasty decision, but at the same time, everything she was experiencing didn't feel real. The man she had shared her life with for almost 20 years was no longer who she had imagined. The love she felt for him seemed to have turned into something unrecognizable. Determined to find answers, Julia called her best friend, Caroline. She needed someone she could trust, someone who could help her see things more clearly. Caroline had always been her confidant, and Julia knew that even in the most difficult situations, she would never judge her. "Caroline, you need to come here right now. I don't know what to do." Julia's voice trembled over the phone. Worried, Caroline immediately canceled her plans and went to Julia's house. When she arrived, she found her friend visibly shaken, her eyes red from crying. "What happened, Julia? What did he tell you?" Caroline asked as she hugged her friend. Julia, still struggling to speak properly, began telling her everything Nolan had revealed. She described the illegal businesses, the connection with her father, the lies that had been told for years. Caroline remained silent throughout the entire narrative, absorbing Julia's words. "I can't believe it, Julia. This is unimaginable," Caroline said after a long silence. Julia shook her head, tears still streaming down her face. "How could he do this to me? How could he hide this for so long? I don't know who to trust anymore. And what do I do now? I need time. I don't know if I can continue with him after all this." Caroline looked her in the eyes. "Seriously. What do you feel now, Julia? What does your heart say?" Julia closed her eyes, trying to connect with her own emotions. The pain was unbearable, but something inside her was beginning to rise again. She knew she couldn't live with a man who had betrayed her so deeply, but the doubt still lingered. Could she forgive him? Could she still save her marriage? "I don't know, Caroline. I love him, but I don't know if I can live with him after all this. I need time to think," Julia said, her voice wavering but determined. Caroline hugged her again, understanding her pain and inner struggle. "Do what's best for you, Julia. I'll be by your side, no matter what happens." Julia thanked her friend, but she knew the road ahead would be filled with doubts and uncertainties. She could no longer trust appearances, and now she needed to reconnect with who she really was, far from Nolan and the lies she had gotten lost in. With a broken heart and a confused mind, Julia made the most difficult decision of her life, to step away from Nolan for a while to find answers within herself. The days after Julia's decision to distance herself from Nolan were the hardest of her life. She was trying to find some kind of peace, but the doubt about the future of her marriage and the revelation of Nolan's past consumed her. She knew that stepping away from him was necessary for her to regain balance, but at the same time, the love she felt for him made everything even harder. Then something unexpected happened. Caroline, who had been Julia's rock during this tumultuous period, came to her with a new revelation. After doing some digging, Caroline had discovered something else about Nolan that Julia didn't know. Nolan's story wasn't complete, and there were more secrets buried in his past. "Julia, I didn't want to tell you this right now, but you need to know. Nolan has more things hidden from you. Things he didn't tell you." Caroline began, her tone serious. Julia looked at her, not knowing what to expect. "What did you find out?" she asked, apprehensive. Caroline took a deep breath and handed Julia an old envelope. "I found this. These are documents Nolan tried to hide from you. They talk about his involvement with a criminal group, something even deeper than you know," Caroline said, as Julia shakily flipped through the papers. Shock overtook Julia as she read the documents. Nolan wasn't just involved in financial crimes. He was connected to an extortion and corruption scheme that involved very dangerous people. She didn't know if the pain of being betrayed was worse than the fear of what Nolan might have gotten himself involved in. "Caroline, what does this mean? How could he hide this from me? How didn't I see anything?" Julia was paralyzed by the revelation. Caroline held her hands firmly. "I know this is a lot to process, but you need to know. The man you loved was not who you thought he was. He got involved in something much bigger than you imagined, Julia. And this could put your life at risk." Julia could no longer believe what she was hearing. She had married a man who not only deceived her, but also put her on a dangerous path. The pain was unbearable, but now there was something else inside Julia, a burning desire to uncover the full truth. Determined to face her husband once and for all, Julia sought out Nolan, who was still trying to stay calm and optimistic, but knew the situation was becoming more complicated than he could handle. When Julia walked into the room, he looked at her, already feeling the weight of the tension in the air. "What do you have to say to me now, Julia?" Nolan asked, his tone uneasy. She, holding the letter and documents in hand, approached him, and her voice was firm. "I know everything, Nolan. About the business, the lies, what you've been hiding from me. And I won't let you deceive me anymore. You were involved in something much deeper, something dangerous, and I deserve to know the truth." Nolan swallowed hard, visibly shaken. "Julia, please. I didn't want to involve you in this. I wanted to protect you from all of it." He tried to explain, but the words sounded empty to her. Julia shook her head, rejecting his words. "Protect? Or did you use me, Nolan? You involved me in lies, and now you're putting everything at risk. I don't know if I can trust you again." She took a step back, feeling the weight of every word. I had to step away, Nolan. I need to protect myself, protect my daughters, and, more importantly, I need to find my own truth, she said, her voice breaking but filled with determination. Nolan remained silent, unsure of what to say. He knew that things would never be the same again. The truth had finally come to light, but now he would have to face the consequences of his actions. Julia, on the other hand, knew she was about to face a new challenge. What would she do with the truth she had just discovered? Would she be able to overcome all of this and move on with her life? Or would the pain of the betrayal be too great to get past? Nolan's story was crumbling, and Julia's future was now in her hands. The time Julia spent away from Nolan was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She tried to focus on her daughter's needs, the house, her life, but the weight of the betrayal and the discoveries about her husband consumed her. As much as she tried to move forward, the love she still felt for Nolan prevented her from making a definitive decision. But the moment to take action was approaching. She knew she could no longer live like this, on the fence, torn between the desire to rebuild the marriage and the fear of what more might be revealed about Nolan. Each day, she felt farther away from him, and Caroline's words echoed in her mind. "You need to protect yourself, Julia. He's not the man you knew anymore." One morning, Julia decided it was time to face the truth once and for all. She called Nolan for a conversation. When he arrived, he was visibly tense, perhaps expecting her to give in, for the longing and love to speak louder. But Julia knew that what he had done couldn't be fixed. She felt lost, but at the same time, there was a renewed strength inside her to take control of her life. "Nolan, I loved you for many years. But you lied to me. You destroyed everything we built," Julia said, her voice firm, but the pain still clear. Nolan tried to approach, but Julia took a step back, making him stop. "Julia, please. I never wanted to hurt you. I made a mistake, I know. But I did all this because I thought I was protecting you. I never thought it would come to this point," Nolan said, his voice full of regret. Julia looked directly into his eyes, with tears about to fall, but with absolute clarity in her mind. "You didn't protect me, Nolan. You deceived me. I spent all these years by your side, believing a lie. You involved me in something much more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. And I can't keep going like this," she said, breathing deeply. Silence took over the room. Nolan, with a desolate expression, stood still, not knowing what to say. The woman he loved, the woman with whom he had built a life, was now standing before him, determined to leave. "Julia, please, don't do this. I'll do anything to make it right. I love you," Nolan begged, trying to touch her hand, but Julia quickly withdrew it. "No, Nolan. There's nothing left to be done. I can't live with this lie anymore. I have to move on, for myself and for my daughters," Julia replied, her voice calm but full of certainty. She took one last look at Nolan, feeling the pain of losing the life she had dreamed of, but at the same time, feeling an unexpected relief, a sense that she was finally freeing herself. "I'm going to file for divorce, Nolan, and you need to understand that this is the only option. I will no longer live in the shadow of what you've done," she said, her voice steady but resolute. Nolan, silent, simply nodded. He knew there was no going back. The woman he loved had made the decision to go her own way, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Julia turned and, before leaving, looked back one last time at Nolan. She knew that this decision would forever change the course of her life, but she felt it was the only choice she could make. She was walking away from a man she had loved, but now he was a stranger to her. When Julia left, a sense of relief washed over her chest. The future was uncertain, but she knew that her freedom and peace of mind were worth more than any past she had to leave behind. She was determined to rebuild her life, now alone, but with a new perspective on what truly mattered. After the decision to separate from Nolan, Julia faced an uncertain future, but at the same time, she felt a sense of relief. She had finally taken control of her life, but the scars of betrayal and loss were still fresh. The doubt about what she would do now, alone, without the man she had thought was her safe haven, still loomed over her. In the first few days after the separation, Julia withdrew from everyone. She allowed herself some time alone, away from friends and family, searching for answers within herself. She knew she had a lot to learn about who she was now, without Nolan by her side, without the weight of lies and fear that had shaped her life up until then. It was during this period of introspection that she remembered an old dream she had put aside many years ago, to open a small bookstore cafe, a place where she could share her passion for books and peaceful moments. Julia had never had the courage to pursue this dream while she was married because she always put her family first. But now, free from constraints, she decided it was time to follow this long-held desire in her heart. She began dedicating herself to planning the bookstore, studying the market, talking to professionals in the field, and above all, believing that she could create something that would make her feel fulfilled and happy. During this process, Julia also started reconnecting with her friends, who supported her unconditionally. Caroline, who had always been by her side, helped her make the toughest decisions and cope with the pain of the divorce, but also encouraged her not to forget herself. You deserve to be happy, Julia. You have your whole life ahead of you, and this is just the beginning. Don't be afraid to start over, Caroline would always say, with a supportive smile. As time went by, Julia gradually found her new identity. She was no longer the woman married to Nolan, but a strong, determined woman who had overcome betrayal and was ready to start over. The bookstore cafe began to take shape, and with it, Julia's confidence grew. She felt that she had found her true purpose, someone who had gone through many trials but was now ready to live the life she had always wanted. She found a new balance, focusing on what made her happy and what truly mattered. The well-being of her daughters, the fulfillment of her own dreams, and the self-love she had to rediscover. Meanwhile, Nolan, who had been an important part of Julia's life, was facing the consequences of his actions. After the divorce, he realized how much he had lost and how much Julia's love meant to him. However, he knew there was no space for regret. The door was closed, and he could do nothing to undo the damage he had caused. Julia, on the other hand, knew that her path no longer depended on Nolan. She didn't need him to be happy. She had found a new strength within herself, something she never thought she had. Her life was being rewritten, and now, the future was in her hands. She finally understood that, although the scars of a broken marriage took time to heal, the pain could be overcome. What truly mattered was what she did with that pain, how she turned the losses into strengths to create a life worth living. And as Julia devoted herself to her new beginning, she knew her story was not yet finished. She still had so much to live, so much to learn, and so much to achieve. The best was yet to come. As Julia began to settle into her new routine, the bookstore cafe finally took shape and became the heart of her reimagined life. The place was not just a business for her. It was a refuge where she felt completely fulfilled. Her customers began to turn into friends, and little by little, she was building a new circle of trust and affection. But what Julia didn't expect was that fate had more surprises in store for her. One afternoon, while she was organizing the new books that had just arrived, a familiar figure walked into the bookstore, a face Julia hadn't seen in years. Ethan, an old college friend, someone she always considered trustworthy and full of life. Ethan had recently moved to the city and, unaware of Julia's new phase in life, came to the bookstore to look for a specific book. When the two of them saw each other, it was as if time had reversed. The sparkle in Ethan's eyes when he saw her, the surprise and genuine joy in his smile, made Julia feel something she wasn't expecting, a sense of reconnection and perhaps a spark of something new. "Julia!" Ethan exclaimed, almost in disbelief. "Is it really you? I didn't know you had a bookstore here." Julia, surprised and smiling shyly, looked at him. "Ethan, I can't believe it's you. It's so good to see you. How have you been?" The conversation flowed naturally, as if the years had been erased. Ethan was also in a new phase of his life, recently separated and looking for a new direction, just like her. They started talking about their pasts, their losses, and the new paths they were taking. Ethan revealed that he was searching for a rare philosophy book, something Julia immediately knew and went to the correct section to get. As he watched her, Julia realized that there was something different about Ethan. He seemed more mature, more centered, and the affection in his gaze made her feel comfortable in a way she hadn't felt with anyone else. The sense of having someone by her side, someone with whom she could share not only what she had lived through but also what she was beginning to live, was something new and comforting. "I always knew you had something special about you, Julia," Ethan said as she handed him the book. "I never imagined that after all this time, life would bring us back to this point." Julia smiled, but her mind was divided. She knew she was going through a very vulnerable moment, still healing from the pain of the divorce and the wounds Nolan had left on her heart. But at the same time, something in Ethan made her feel safe and understood, as if he knew what she was going through without even needing to ask. The afternoon passed quickly, with them talking about various topics, and when Ethan said goodbye, he left something Julia couldn't ignore: the promise of a new meeting. "I'd love to invite you to dinner. Just the two of us. What do you think?" Ethan suggested, looking into her eyes. Julia hesitated, feeling the weight of the invitation, but the truth was that something inside her made her accept. She knew she wasn't ready for a new relationship yet, but something about Ethan attracted her in an irresistible way. "Sure, I think that would be great," she replied, smiling sincerely. As she watched him leave the bookstore, Julia felt a mix of emotions. She was still healing, but a part of her soul seemed to have reopened, ready for new possibilities. What she didn't know was that this casual encounter was not only the beginning of a renewed friendship, but something that could change her life in ways she never imagined. The dinner with Ethan took place a few weeks after their unexpected encounter in the bookstore. Julia's anxiety was at a high point. Although she knew she wasn't ready to jump into a new relationship, there was something about Ethan that awakened a sense of comfort and curiosity in her. The meeting would be an opportunity to explore this connection, without rushing, just enjoying the moment and seeing where it could lead. When the day finally arrived, Julia prepared herself carefully. She chose a simple yet elegant dress that made her feel good about herself. She wanted this dinner to be special, but at the same time, she didn't want to set overly high expectations. It wasn't about a fresh start immediately, but about an opportunity to feel alive again, something she was beginning to rediscover in her life. Ethan chose a cozy and welcoming restaurant, the kind of place where conversations flow naturally and time seems to slow down. When Julia arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile, and the chemistry between them was palpable. They sat down, exchanged glances, and started talking about everything and nothing at the same time. But there was something else in the air, an unspoken tension that made the atmosphere even more charged with possibilities. "You know, Julia, after all this time, I realized that we should never have drifted apart. I've always admired you. I always felt we had a connection that no other relationship has ever had," Ethan said with a serious and sincere tone. Julia, surprised by the sincerity of his words, didn't know how to react. She felt something in her heart, but she didn't want to fool herself. She knew that words and gestures could be superficial at moments like this. She wanted to be sure that, if she followed any new path, it would be a life decision, not an impulse. "I felt our connection too, Ethan. But I'm just not ready to get involved again. I'm still healing," she said calmly but firmly. Ethan smiled understandingly, seeming to accept her words without resistance. They continued talking about other topics, but the tension was still there, though it no longer felt uncomfortable. At the end of dinner, as they were saying their goodbyes, he looked Julia in the eyes and made a proposal that took her by surprise. "I understand, Julia. I don't want to rush anything. But how about, instead of a new relationship, we start with a friendship? We can take it slow, with no pressure, and see where the future leads us. I respect your space, and I believe that, no matter what, our connection deserves to be lived in some way." Julia was silent for a moment, reflecting on his words. She knew her life was in a phase of rebuilding, but Ethan's proposal, though unexpected, seemed like something she could accept. She needed time, a new type of relationship, one where she could feel safe without the weight of expectations and pressure. "I think we can try, Ethan. One step at a time," she replied, smiling gently. As she said goodbye to Ethan, Julia felt a sense of relief. She was taking control of her life but also remaining open to new possibilities. The friendship with Ethan could be an opportunity to heal her wounds gradually and respectfully, without rushing to define what the future would hold. What Julia still didn't know was that this friendship could quickly become deeper than she imagined. And what she considered a new beginning was only the preparation for a twist that would change everything in her life once again. Julia had started to feel more at peace with the way things were unfolding. The connection she had with Ethan was becoming a comfortable friendship, and she was grateful for it. Her days at the bookstore continued to bring her joy and fulfillment, and for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. But, just when everything seemed to be falling into place, a new revelation came crashing into her life. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Julia received an unexpected visitor at the bookstore. She was sorting through some new stock when the bell above the door chimed, signaling the arrival of a customer. She looked up, only to freeze in place when she saw the face that had been haunting her thoughts for months. It was Nolan, her ex-husband. Her heart skipped a beat as she felt a flood of emotions rush through her. Anger, betrayal, and confusion. Why was he here? After everything that had happened, after all the pain he had caused her, he had the audacity to show up in her life again. Nolan stood there for a moment, as if unsure how to approach her. His face, once so familiar, now seemed like a distant memory. He had aged since their divorce, but his presence still held a strange power over her. Julia's breath hitched, and her thoughts raced. What did he want now? Julia, I know this is the last place you probably want to see me, but I need to talk to you, Nolan said, his voice barely above a whisper. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step back. You've got some nerve, Nolan. After everything that happened, after how you destroyed my life, you think I want to talk to you? Nolan looked pained, his gaze filled with guilt. Please, just hear me out. I know I messed up, but there's something I need to tell you. Something that you don't know, something that will change everything. Julia's anger flared, but a small part of her was intrigued. What could he possibly say now that would make any difference? She had heard enough lies and excuses during their marriage to last a lifetime. But there was something in his eyes, something desperate, that made her pause. Fine. Say what you need to say. But if this is some kind of joke, I swear to God I'll... It's not a joke, Julia. It's about your family. There's something you don't know, something that your family has kept from you all these years. Nolan's voice trembled as he spoke, and Julia felt a chill run down her spine. Julia's expression changed as his words sank in. Her family? What was he talking about? The confusion and uncertainty in her mind grew, and she found herself questioning everything. What secret could Nolan possibly know about her family? What do you mean? She asked, her voice unsteady. Nolan took a deep breath, collecting himself before continuing. There's something in your family's past, something that was hidden from you. I didn't know about it at first, but when I found out, I realized why everything fell apart between us. It wasn't just me, Julia. Your family has a dark secret, and it's the reason your life has been so complicated. Julia's world seemed to shift beneath her feet. What was he talking about? What could this secret possibly be? No, this can't be true. Julia's voice shook with disbelief. You're lying. You're just trying to make yourself feel better. Nolan shook his head slowly, his eyes full of regret. I wish I were, Julia. But I swear to you, it's the truth. I wouldn't say this if it weren't. Julia was shaken to her core. The man she had loved, the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way, was now telling her that her family was hiding something. Something so significant that it could change everything. As much as she wanted to turn away, as much as she wanted to tell him to leave and never come back, she knew she couldn't. The seed of doubt had been planted, and she had to find out the truth. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for what you did to me, Nolan. But I need to know what you're talking about, Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. Nolan nodded gravely. I'll tell you everything. But you're not going to like it, Julia. What you find out will change everything, and it may destroy everything you've rebuilt. Julia swallowed hard, trying to brace herself for whatever was coming next. The world she had so carefully reconstructed was now hanging by a thread, and a secret she had never known was about to tear everything apart. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel and press the like button. Thank you.